Hello, everyone, and welcome to Into the Terminal. Today, we're going to be covering installing WordPress on RHEL. So,
Yeah.
why don't you jump us into the terminal and take it away?
So, Scott, I have a quick wager for you. Do you think I can deploy WordPress on RHEL in under 5 minutes?
I do, because I
You
have
do? No, you're
taken
you're
confidence in
supposed
your
to
abilities.
you're supposed to be like, no, that's impossible. Try that again. Do you think I can?
No, that's impossible. Only someone ludicrous would try to do such a thing.
Well, check this out. So I've done a ton of WordPress on RHEL. So I've already got a little definition here that we're going to use for the critical path. But don't worry, folks. After the break, we are going to go into the full nitty gritty how to deploy WordPress on RHEL. But this felt like the perfect thing for the critical path. So I've made. Let's go back to the top of this file here. I've made a pod deployment for Podman based on the WordPress official container and the MariaDB official container, right? And this is what I use whenever I need to deploy a new WordPress site for myself, right? And I've got a couple for my own personal projects and whatever. So if you've never looked at one of these before, I basically handcrafted a WordPress pod, and then I used Podman's generate feature to export that to a Kubernetes kubelet, I think they call it. I'm not a Kubernetes guy, but I'm told that that's what it's called. Basically, this defines some variables here. You can see there's a bunch of environment variables for things like what root password to use and what database to use, things like that. Tells it what container to use for the database, MariaDB. I like to specify a version. You see, I call out a specific version. That way, if I'm upgrading my container later, it doesn't change the MariaDB underlying version on me and confuse my database, right? The WordPress image, I use the latest because when you're updating the WordPress image, you're going to want the latest anyway, right? Same deal, a bunch of environment variables. We've got some volumes defined here. You can see we've got the MySQL or MariaDB database called out to a volume within Podman. All those volumes are then defined later at the bottom here. See, we've got a bunch of host path volumes that point to a directory path within serve, which is where I like to put my container data. You can question that if you'd like. But basically, I've done all that just to sort of give you some background here. All we have to do to make this work. Oh, wait, there is one last thing I forgot to change. Let me go back here. There's this place where it specifies the port. I forgot to do that in my template for today's show. So we're going to change this 8080 because that's a little easier for my demo later. But you can see, right? So the ports, where it maps to, and all that is inside of this definition here. Now, all we do is podman play kube, and then the name of the file. And cross your fingers, but this should go and get the MariaDB container. It should get the WordPress container. It should deploy them within a pod called WordPress, because that's what I told it to do. It'll set all those environment variables. It'll tell WordPress where to find its database. It'll all happen within the internal networking within Podman. And at the other end of this, we should have a WordPress site up and running, ready for us to run the sort of post-installation WordPress configuration, which happens in your web browser. So let's just give this a second to finish up.
So, Nate, why do you like using the container images?
I like using the containers because they make these deployments super simple. They're easier to update. I don't know if you noticed in the directory structure that I showed earlier, I have a subdirectory called Quadlet. You can also put this stuff into Quadlet so that you can manage the entire pod via systemd, which is pretty cool. We're not going to talk about that on today's show, but that's the way I do it, right? When I run a new site, or really at this point, anything in Podman, I throw it in a Quadlet. Makes it really easy to restart and stop the service. And every time you do that, it pulls the latest containers, right? So it makes sure your service is all up to date.
Yeah, because one of the big things with WordPress is like people stand it up and then forget about it. And
Yeah,
over time, they don't update it, and it has all these gnarly places where people can exploit stuff and get your data out of it. That you probably
exactly. WordPress has in the past had sort of a reputation for being this terribly insecure thing. It's not necessarily WordPress's fault. There was a point where the WordPress code base and a lot of the plugins that were available for it weren't as well maintained as they could be. A lot of that has changed now. And really what it comes down to now is how you administer it. So I have to switch shares here so I can go to a different browser tab here. So let's stop this one and then I'll start a new one.
And JSCAR points out that we are at 4 minutes.
Exactly, under 5 minutes. All right, new share is ready, and here you go. This is the WordPress setup. We can walk through this. We're gonna pick English, right? We're gonna give our website a super awesome name like ITT's Awesome WordPress. You can tell from my browser history that I've already done this before in my testing. It automatically gives us a relatively secure password here that I'm just gonna copy to my clipboard and go ahead and accept. That generates that at random when you initiate this thing. I'm going to forever emblazon my Red Hat email address into our live stream here, and we're going to go install WordPress. And it's going to ask me to save the password. I don't know if you're seeing that. No, you're not. Let me. Okay, and then we can just log in. We're going to get it, say Nate, and we're going to paste that password in and log in, and we should be at the WordPress admin page. Look at that. So now at this point, you can go through and it's super easy to add plugins and all kinds of stuff because the container is designed to do things like let you administer this WordPress site, through the WordPress admin. So you don't have to actually even get a shell ever in your container unless you really want to do some advanced stuff. So if I wanted to add a new plugin, I could do it right through this UI. If I want to install updates, which I think there may be updates available because it's not always up to date completely right out of the box. I just click this update plugins and it's going to go and do the updates because the container is set up to make this as dirt simple as possible. So there you go, WordPress in under 5 minutes.
Great. Well, don't forget to mash that like and subscribe button so we will keep making content just like this and you'll get notified when we do. Stay with us for after the transition. Nate, we're going to cover installing WordPress on a system individually
on a plain old RHEL box. We're going to use the same box. I'm just going to, while we're talking, I'm going to turn off that pod so it doesn't get confusing, and then we're going to do it from scratch.
Awesome. So we'll see you after the transition. So Nate, I think containers are awesome, and it definitely gives a different way of modularly building your sites and maintaining them. But that's not how I think the majority of people deploy WordPress today, right?
Yeah. So what I'm going to demonstrate today is sort of a level a little bit deeper than even what WordPress themselves advertise as how to deploy WordPress. They're in a funny situation where they have to make their installation as easy as possible because they want people to be able to use the site, and they know that people are going to be coming to them with just like, I've got a cooking blog. I'm not an IT person. I just want to run my blog, right? And there's a bunch of ways that you can make that happen through hosting providers and whatnot. But if you want to do it yourself, there are some nitty gritty that you have to think about. The container is one way to get that done easily. Their instructions, they use like phpMyAdmin for the database stuff, which I don't necessarily like to put on servers. But if that's the crutch that you need, then, go ahead and use it. Just be careful. Make sure that it's not accessible to the world and things like that. So I'm going to start my terminal share again. Just a sec here. Find the right tab. And we can get right into it. Were there any questions while we were chatting? I'm not really looking at chat.
I think there were just celebrations that you delivered on your promise of WordPress in 5 minutes.
Pretty cool, right? Now, I'm going to be completely honest. The background to get all that ready so I could deploy it in 5 minutes took me longer than 5 minutes. But if anybody's really, really curious and want that definition, I can get it to you. All right. So first things first, we need to install some packages. So let me just there's a whole list of them here. And I assume that we will put these in the description if anybody just wants them and doesn't want to try to copy them down quickly here. But basically, we're adding in Apache, we're adding in Maria, we're adding in the Maria server. That's the Maria client and the server. Unzip, because it comes as a zip package, WordPress, that is. We need to be able to decompress it somehow. PHP, of course, the PHP database abstraction, PDO, and PHP's MySQL libraries, and the PHP CLI, because I think it's good to have for troubleshooting purposes, although we're not really going to delve into that today because everything should just work. Cross your fingers. Just work, quote unquote.
I think you've cursed yourself now, Nate.
I probably did. There's probably a typo somewhere in the instructions that I've got in our script here, and that's going to ruin everything on me.
But I mean, as long as you don't leave your room, because then I'll lose internet.
Yeah, totally. That's how that works. There's a relay on, or I should say a contact that triggers a relay that breaks Scott's internet when I open that door and walk out of it. Okay, now we're going to turn on both HTTPD and MariaDB. There you go. Good old system control commands there. We're also going to go and get the source for WordPress, which that's one of the cool things about WordPress. Completely open source. That's why we love it, or why I love it. Okay, then we're just going to unzip it. And that URL, wordpress.org/latest, will always get you the latest, which is why it's called latest. Comes down as latest.zip. So we're going to unzip it. Goes into a subdirectory called WordPress. You could just throw WordPress into var.html, and then your website will live at, your site name /WordPress. But I'm going to put it into the root of var.html because that's all we're going to run in this particular instance. So we're going to go into WordPress, and we're just going to copy the whole thing into var.html. Okay. Now, if we look at, should be all the contents that were inside of that zip file. Now, there's 100 ways you could get that done. You could find their Git repo and clone it. You could unzip it directly in var.dub, but whatever. That's the way I got it done. We will have to set permissions later, but because there's other files we have to modify in there before this goes live, I'm going to save that till closer to the end. All right. The next thing we need to do is get MariaDB ready to go. So we're going to use mysqladmin to set a root password. I'm setting it to Red Hat. Don't do that. Set it to something that's a little more secure. And then we're going to go into the MariaDB or MySQL client to connect to our MariaDB machine. Give it that super secure password. And there we go at a prompt. Now, if you're familiar with SQL syntax, you can just go ham on this, right? If you're a database person. I had to learn a ton of database stuff over the years through my life as a systems administrator. I'm not going to go too deep here. I've only scratched the surface, right? But okay, we're going to make a database called WordPress. Again, you can name this whatever you want. Just remember what you call it, because later you're going to have to tell WordPress what database it uses. We're going to make a user with a password specifically for WordPress's use. Okay, so you could, don't do this. You could just give WordPress root onto your database and boom, it can just go do its thing. Don't do that. You should make a user. This is better practice. Make a user, give it, I just hit enter in the wrong thing and erased one of my commands. Okay. Give it a user with its own password, and then you give that user specifically access to the WordPress database. That way, if someone were to do something nasty with your WordPress instance, they can't like destroy your database or add stuff to your database or make your database run procedures you don't want it to. Those are all things you can do as root that you don't want people to be able to do normally. Okay, so we made the user. Now we're going to grant all the privileges on the WordPress database. You see, that's what this on WordPress star means. That means all the tables within WordPress. You're going to give this particular user, WP user at localhost, access. Now that at localhost is important. This isn't like a DBA course, but that tells it what host that user is allowed to connect to. If you're running your database on a different host, then you can't tell that localhost. You have to tell it the host that it's coming from. You can either do that with IP address or by DNS name, however you want to do it. I've had lots of arguments with people about whether it's more secure to do it by host name or by IP address, because host names can be spoofed, so not cool. But again, just things to keep in mind if you're doing this stuff. So we're going to grant those privileges. And then it's best practice, although sometimes I've done this, sometimes I haven't, and it's never really hurt me. But there is a command that you can run that tells MariaDB to basically reread its permissions table, and that's flush privileges, right? And now our database should be ready. We can just exit out of here, and we're back to our command prompt.
So we did have one question in the chat.
Sure.
From Vincent. He asked about SE Linux and var www, and I think we negotiated a little bit. So we're using var www, but
Right.
if we were to WordPress site content elsewhere, would we have SE Linux problems?
Yeah, you'd have to reapply the context or set the contexts and then reapply them, right? You have to add it to your policy, essentially. I will probably do a restore con in var HTML before we consider this done, although it may be unnecessary, right? So that's, we can look and see what context got assigned. Sometimes it depends on how you've copied it. If you let me think. There's like, if you copy it in, it reapplies contexts, but if you move it in, it keeps the initial ones. I don't remember exactly.
A copy creates brand new files in your target directory, so they get the default text for that directory.
There you go.
Move drags the metadata of the file with it, including contexts.
Right.
But you know what, Nate? This is a great idea. Maybe we should do an SE Linux show next week.
Maybe we should. Here, you can see I just did an ls-lz in var HTML, and there you go. It's got the right context already. So just what Scott was saying. There's no reason to do the restore con because it's already got the right stuff. All right. Where was I? The next thing was to move here. All right. Now we have to actually set up the WordPress configuration file. So you can see in here, there's a WP config sample. Here it is. .php. Right. We're going to take that and we're going to move it to WP config.php. And oh, sorry, I have to typo. Move WP config sample to WP config PHP. You have to have a source and a destination, not just the destination. And then we're going to open it in everybody's favorite text editor, but only if I get the right file name. All right, so you're going to see in here there are config variables. If you're familiar with PHP, this looks really familiar. We're making variable definitions. We're telling it the variable name and the value. If you don't know much about PHP, don't worry. They make it pretty simple. You just have to find where it says DB name. It even gives you a comment here that says this is where your database settings have to go. All you have to do is find this. It's pretty straightforward. We have to change the database name to the name of our database, right? So we're going to delete this. And you remember what we called the database? It was really creative. WordPress. Okay, DB user. We're going to have to change that. What do I call them? WP user, right? That was in the commands earlier. Let me just make sure. Yes, WP user. Okay, and notice I didn't have to use that at localhost because it reads that from where you're connecting from. So just the WP user. And we need to put the password in here. Password I used was WPPASSWD. Again, super secure, not recommended. And if you did put your database on a different host, this is where you would tell it. Different host, right? This says localhost because I'm running on the same host. Generally, people consider it bad practice to put your database and your website on the same host because that opens you up to some possible nastiness. If somebody were to compromise your web application, they could also get to your database super easy. So probably don't do this. But again, this is for demo purposes, and I'm showing you how to change that. If you want to get advanced, you can change the character set and the collation on your database. There's really no reason to change that unless you really know what you're doing. So I'm not going to touch those. Okay, now the other important thing is WordPress does some stuff to make things like your cookies and whatnot, and your API, or I think your API, whatever, a little more secure by adding keys and salts. And that's what this whole block here is all about. Now, you might be like, well, how do I get keys and salts for that? And the easiest way to do that is if you look right up here in these comments, there's a link here for api.wordpress.com/secret-key 1.1/salt. Now, I'm going to copy this and put it in a different browser tab and paste it. I'm not going to switch my share around because that'll just make a headache. Trust me when I say what you do is you go to that site. It outputs in a very plain manner exactly that same code block with keys populated. It generates them for you. All you have to do is copy them. And then I am going to go back to the other tab here, and we're just going to delete these lines. You could comment them if you'd rather, but I'm going to delete them, and then we're going to paste in what the website gave me. So you can see, that simple. All I had to do was go to that URL. It gave me keys, and then I pasted them in here. Now, if you want to generate your own, go ahead. I don't care. I take the easy route when I can. All right. I think that is that. We're going to save that out. That's all the changes we have to make to the WordPress configuration. Now, let's make sure. All right, so another thing I want to talk about was file system permissions for WordPress. In the current permissions, if you're looking at my screen, you can see that that all of this web tree is owned by root. Apache does not run as root. So that means that Apache cannot write to this directory or these files, which you could say is a good thing, right? Because you don't want Apache or maybe someone who's compromised your website to be able to change any of the code that's in here, right? However, WordPress has auto-update mechanisms, right? So if you go to WordPress, you go to your WordPress site, like I did earlier when I clicked that button and said update my plugins, it also has an automatic plugins installation feature where you can add plugins right through the web UI. If you want those features to work, your web server needs to be able to write to the WordPress code tree. So you need to decide which way you want to handle this. If you want to do updates in a more manual way, there are mechanisms where you can tell WordPress how to FTP or SCP into your, or I should say SFTP into your web host, and then you can do updates that way. That way you don't have to actually give the Apache user permissions to this. But the sort of easy way, and the way that I think WordPress even documents that you should do it, is to just give the whole web root ownership to Apache. I don't love doing it that way. Me, I'm paranoid, right? It's up to you how you want to do this. So we're going to do it that way for this particular example. And we're just going to take this whole web root, change the ownership to Apache. Again, you need to decide whether that's acceptable to your security posture or not. Okay, and what we should be able to do now, I think that covers everything. Any other questions that came up while we were talking?
No, we continue to hash through one of the SE Linux vagaries.
Okay.
But I think we'll get into more of those next week. But yeah, I think that's it.
Okay, so I need to switch my share again because I think we are ready to show off this newly built website. Give me just a sec here. All right, so this brings us back to the old site that because I'm using the same browser tab. I just need to change the URL here, drop off that 8080. So I think we're on 80 now, and we should get WordPress installation. There you go. So this is the new code base I just put in. I didn't show it to you for proof, but I did stop and destroy that other pod that we used for the first example. So this is the site that we just put in place. So I can go back here and make this ITT's awesome WordPress site. I can copy this password again. Can't spell redhat.com apparently. And we're going to install WordPress. Go to login, Nate, paste that password, and there we go. WordPress up and running. My browser keeps asking me to save the password. Stop Stop asking.
So, Nate, if we, you said that there are two methods that we could use for updating. One is we
Mhm.
can use UI here to update, but we
Yep.
had to own all of our files to be owned by the Apache user because this application is running as the Apache user.
Right.
The other method was if you log into the machine as the administrative user, would you just like download a newer WordPress zip and unzip it again?
So yeah, the way WordPress organizes the code tree, there's a subdirectory called wp-content, and that's where all of your user-generated content and I think the plugins live, right? So everything's within there. So if you download the code tree for WordPress and re-extract it into the root of your WordPress site, it doesn't overwrite that. In fact, I don't think WP content is even included in the archive, but don't quote me on that because I haven't looked. But basically, that's what you have to save. You have to make sure that doesn't get overwritten, and then it will give you the latest version of WordPress. Now, once you've done that, there's like an update or a PHP file that you have to run. WordPress will tell you that when you first log into the admin interface after you've updated the code tree. And what that does is if there's like database schema updates or whatever, it'll run them for you because it does have permission to do that. Plugins, same way. You'd have to go get the plugin that you installed and you'd have to put it in place and decompress it into the right directory. This is kind of like the old way that we all used to manage our websites. If you can recall the dark times when everybody had to have SSH access to a machine in order to to update their website. But like I said, there's also mechanisms. I didn't go over them in that config file, but in the WordPress config, there is a place where you can say, my website lives at this, let's just say SFTP URL. Here's a username and a password you can use, and WordPress can go get the code. It stores it somewhere, and then it uploads it into that SFTP directory, right? So it can still do it for you, and that's probably a little more secure than giving Apache just carte blanche to your whole web root, right? So those are things that you can consider, and there's documentation all over WordPress's website about how to get that done.
So we did get a late breaking question
Sure.
from Ding. Secure with IP tables or SE Linux? And that is a complex question.
Secure with IP tables or SE Linux? I would say yes, because they both secure in different ways, right? So, and it's not IP tables anymore; it's actually NF tables, but you manage it with firewall D. So you would, in my opinion, secure with a host-based firewall that says the only ports that are accessible from the outside world are 80 and 443, because we didn't talk about that, but you should definitely put a TLS certificate in front of this when you run it. Which in the Docker or the Podman setup that I showed at the beginning, I didn't touch that at all. There are ways to make that happen in the container. You can also put a proxy in front of it, which is the way I usually do it. But yeah, you would want your firewall config to say only the publicly accessible ports should be open in the firewall. The MariaDB port should not be allowed to anything, but maybe my administrators, maybe they want to connect to MariaDB remotely, right? And then SE Linux, yeah, I would have SE Linux on. I would have it enforcing, and I would make sure all my contexts are in place properly, because there have been WordPress vulnerabilities in the past that SE Linux has thwarted. You know, some sort of a code execution thing or whatever that requires your web application to be able to write a file to your local file system. SE Linux turned on, you can flat out prevent that because it can't access anything that you told it it can't.
And I will like just plus one Nate's why not both? Um, we strongly believe in a security in depth posture
Yes.
for all Red Hat stuffs. And so essentially, like the host based firewall will protect your machine from getting attached to by unintended people or to ports that you did not intend. Right. So you can write the rules of who's allowed to contact this host. And then the second layer is SE Linux, which is if they've contacted the host, they've passed through your firewall, what are the permissions granted to the application they're connecting to? So, like, what files can it access? What ports can it use? Uh, what additional executables can it have access to? So, really, you want to use both, one to control who connects to the machine from the outside, and the other one to control what happens after they connect to the application. What can the application do once it's running?
Right. So yeah, secure all the things. including your passwords. Make sure the passwords are nice and secure for your WordPress site. That's another thing that should be mentioned. WordPress is one of the most popular web platforms on the internet. I forget what the percentage is, but there's this crazy market share of WordPress sites that are, blogs and businesses and everything on the internet, which means it is a huge target for attackers, because all they got to do is find a business where their WordPress site is not administered properly, and they can get some juicy data, or they can, at the very least, join your web server to their botnet, right? So you got to be on top of things. You've got to think about securing your WordPress site. You've got to make sure the passwords are good. There's ways that you can hide the WP admin interface. A lot of people highly recommend that. I don't do that because I just make sure that my logins are protected through multi-factor and a good password. But yeah, there's lots of layers here between the OS level security, keeping the thing up to date, keeping your password secure, just everything. And there's extra plugins that do like web application firewall style things for WordPress. So I'd recommend looking into those as well.
All right, so we're at the top of the episode. Don't forget to like and subscribe. If you like, that's good for us. We like it. If you subscribe, you'll be notified when we are scheduling episodes, thanks to producer Eric, or are about to go live on an episode. If you're a deferred viewer, please interact with us in the comments. Our live viewers get to talk to us via the chat, but deferred viewer, comment. And we do monitor and respond to comments. So Nate, next week.
Next week, we're going to talk about SE Linux Essentials. We talked a lot about SE Linux today. So yeah, we're definitely going to go a little deeper on it next week.
Yeah, with like actual commands and demos.
Yeah. Yeah, we didn't actually issue a single SE Linux command today. Except for looking at the context. I guess that counts.
Does it though? That's an LS. Now we're going to get
Yeah.
new to like complain that we use not enough commands.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Great to see you all today. Enjoy the episode, and happy Into the Terminaling.
Yeah. Wait, you almost forgot. RHEL Presents is coming up. We're talking about subscriptions with Rich Dorito. You never want to miss a Rich Dorito live stream. He's a fun guy.
Rich Dorito live stream.
Let's see if we can keep him from swearing on the live stream. You think that'll work?
Only time will tell.
All right.
All right, everybody. See you around.
Yep. Have a great one. Happy WordPressing.